Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. One of the things that we've been watching unfold for the last couple of years has been the rise of freedom rallies and freedom marches. But one of the things that's happened with those freedom rallies and those freedom marches is that they have quickly become about a whole lot more than just the mask mandates or just the public health restrictions. There's a very dangerous undercurrent of things going on with a lot of those events, and we wanted to talk about those. So that's what we're doing today, and we're doing it with the assistance of somebody who knows quite a bit about what these things are going on and who some of the people are that are involved in the background. Kurt Phillips is a board member for the, let me get it right here. He's a board member for the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. He also is a writer and one of the founders of the AntiRacist Collective. And he wears a few other hats that we may or may talk about. Kurt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
So before we get started, I just want to get ahead of what I know are going to be some of the comments that we get on this episode, which are going to be, why are two middle-aged white guys talking about racism? And for me, and this is going to be my first question to you in a sec, but for me, one of the really important parts of dealing with racism is making sure that people see that there are folks who are typically associated with the propagation of some of these views standing up and saying, no, that's bullshit. And so to me, as a middle-aged white guy, it's really important for me to make it clear where my stances are on issues of racism and prejudice and all of that sort of thing, because I think that it's important for other middle-aged white guys to see that it's not just the victims of racism who are standing up against it. It's the people who enjoy some of the most privilege. So that's my first question to you, Kurt. What got you involved in the anti-racist actions that you've been doing for quite some time now?
Well, it's actually kind of fortuitous you talk about privilege too. I mean, I always acknowledge this. I mean, I've never and will never face racism, discrimination. I am as close to the power elite as you could possibly get. I'm a middle class, middle age white guy who's professional. So ultimately, people who might look at me and say, "Yeah, what do you know about this experience?" I go, "I know nothing about this experience. I've never experienced it. I will never know what it's like. I do know it's wrong. I do know that discrimination is wrong. I know that treating people poorly is wrong." And that's where I came from it initially. I remember when I was a child, I was sitting at home with my mother, and this is years and years ago. And my mother was never concerned about what TV shows you watch per se. She was always somebody who explained things. So I don't know the name of it. I don't know the title, but I remember this movie. And it was about the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. And I couldn't get through my mind at that time why they were doing these horrible things to people based on how they looked or their religion. It didn't make any sense to me. And as I grew up, my first degree is in anthropology, and although I was more interested in archaeology initially, and worked as an archaeologist, in fact, but I began to move more towards the cultural aspect of it, and I was fascinated by and horrified by these fringe movements. I came of age when the Heritage Front was the major hate group in Canada, the largest hate group in Canada since the Klan of the 1920s in Saskatchewan. So I kind of absorbed everything that I could at the time. Again, almost much of it was pre-internet, but I was both fascinated and horrified by it, and I wanted to know what made people tick. And as I got a little bit older and I immersed myself a little bit more in it, I thought, well, I've attained a degree of information and knowledge about these groups and these individuals. Maybe there's something I could do that could be useful in terms of exposing what they're up to. The rhetoric that they claim we're peaceful, nonviolent, and how that is belied by the reality of what they're doing. And I think we still see that today. Groups like the Proud Boys, for example, claim to be a kind of a patriotic civic nationalist organization, when in fact they're involved in some, particularly in the United States, in some pretty ugly violence directed at people of color, women, and others. And when you go into their social media, the social media they think that most people don't look at, you really get a real view of what they believe. It's like David Duke never uses the N word in public, but certainly did when he was in private, based on a lot of firsthand information. Again, that's kind of why I got into it. The reality that this exists, and I think we all have a responsibility to do something about it. And um, I will always defer to people who experience this. I will always listen to their concerns because they're the ones who know better than I do. But if I didn't do something, if I didn't try to do something, I wouldn't feel good about myself.
Okay. And that's kind of I like how you said that, because that's kind of the point that I was trying to make at the beginning, in that while there's no question that the voices of people who are experiencing prejudice and racism need to be elevated, and we've certainly tried to do that on this show, it's a societal problem, and it's going to require everybody stepping up. And I think that's where it gets really important for folks like you and me to make it clear where we stand. So what was if you can just kind of walk us through what your path was like on that. So like you're a board member for the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. You founded the AntiRacist Collective. How did all of that come to be a thing?
Well, it started when I moved to Alberta. I began teaching here in 2002, and not long after moving here, there was a hate group that emerged in Edmonton called Western Canada for Us, and I started to do the same kind of research I was doing before, and I was able to figure out who some of the people were, the ones that always hide their identities and such. Um, Now, this is, when I was a little bit maybe more arrogant, a little bit more naive as well. And I wrote an article on one of these individuals for on indie media, never realizing too that I left a mile wide, able to figure out who I was, which they did. So that was a bit of a humbling lesson there in terms of, yeah, you're smart enough to figure out who they are, and don't underestimate them. They could probably figure out who you are as well. But I kept on with that. I actually started a database of hate groups, hate individuals, members of these hate groups as well. But it really didn't feel like enough. So in 2007, November 2007, I started writing about them. And my focus was at the time, and I thought it was going to be exclusively on the then Aryan Guard that emerged in 2006 in Calgary. But very quickly began to focus on the rest of Canada. I was always a little bit iffy on Quebec. I'm sadly unilingual, and I'm embarrassed by that. Uh, but it really kind of shows you the scope of the problem in Canada. It's not just, when people in Canada think that, well, Alberta, this is conservative redneck. Of course they're going to be there. Well, yeah, they're here, but they're also in Ontario. They're also in BC. They're in Saskatchewan. They're Manitoba. They're all over. So, in fact, a lot of the ones who became active here originally from other provinces. So it's a problem that we face all throughout Canada. So that's when I started. I started a blog. I am technically mostly inept. I'm really awful at it, and people usually laugh because the very first iteration of Anti-Racist Canada, our collective, was on LiveJournal, because it
Oh
was
wow.
the only blog I really knew about at the time, and that got shut down. I thought, well, okay, well, let's try this blogger thing, and it was there for ever since. And uh, but I think I think Mac Lemero, Vice likened it to what he said, something that looked like it came out of 2010. I know that was probably optimistic. It's much jankier than that.
It's not MySpace.
Well, no, that's true. That's true. Although, if it were still around, that would be the first one I would have tried.
There you go. So let's get to kind of what we're here to talk about, and that is these freedom rallies, and how they, some people have said that they've started from places of opportunistic recruitment, but I don't think there's any question that that's certainly one of the things that's come of them. So walk me through kind of your experience with watching these things unfold, and what you see with them?
Well, I think it's important to note that they didn't, of course, come out of a vacuum. One of the things that I and others have observed is that there was always some sort of precursor. So I could go back much further than this, but it started. It started. It didn't start, but we could start with 2015, the lead up to the federal election, where the then Harper Conservatives were defeated by the Trudeau Liberals. Leading up to that, uh, the Harper government and Stephen Harper, uh, threw out a bunch of dog whistles. The promise to create a hotline for barbaric cultural practices, which was very much a dog whistle for report your Muslim neighbors. The statement about old stock Canadians, which he claimed wasn't racist, but has been used by every single racist group since then to describe the other people who don't look like me or you. Um, uh, so it started. If we're going to start, it say it started there, and the movement to these kind of groups emerging on social media. Not long after, there was Iqra Qaid, her M103 motion, which was a non-binding motion to condemn Islamophobia and all other forms of racism, at the same time as Canada was welcoming Syrian refugees. So we had the anti-refugee movement that started that time, anti M103, and we had these massive rallies. I think we're probably going to talk about the Pulaski brothers eventually at one point. I knew about them peripherally before, but I really began to know who they were as a result of their involvement with the anti-immigrant, anti-refugee movement. Arthur was a keynote speaker at an event organized by a group with the not very subtle name Worldwide Coalition Against Islam, which wasn't really worldwide or much of a coalition. It was basically four guys, but still. Um, but then we move from that into the Yellow Vest movement. Okay. The Yellow Vest movement in France started as an anti-government, more kind of a leftist kind of movement. In Canada, it was very much a right-wing movement and anti-government, pro-oil. Um, in between all these, of course, you have movements that started too, like Soldiers of Odin, which started in Finland but became a major group in Canada for a time. For roughly a year, it was kind of one of the major concerns that I had until it inevitably kind of broke up into various provincial chapters. But we see basically the same, quite often some of the same people moving from movement to movement to movement. And now, of course, we have the anti-lockdown, anti-mask, anti-COVID vaccination, and a lot of these people are using the same rhetoric they're using about Muslims, about immigrants, about the other, essentially. The very racist language regarding Dr. Tam, for example, is being used. And I always find it ironic that the same people who don't believe COVID exists are also the same people who are blaming Chinese immigration as for the virus. So there's no need to maintain any degree of consistency in their belief system. Um, but we've also, of course, seen that there are groups that have been there who have tried to use this and the I guess you could say radicalization that this movement and social media has resulted in, or has helped create, trying to get recruits from that as well. So groups like Canada First or Plaid Army or these other groups that are emerged, trying to use this kind of wedge issue, and of course bring in there. Well, it's if you're really concerned about the country, it's not just these vaccines. It's also those immigrants that are coming in, the refugees, Jews, whatever they deem as the enemy.
Have you noticed, because you've been following this for quite some time, is there a bit of a recurring theme where some of these individuals will latch on to whatever the topic of the day is, whether or not it's Syrian refugees, whether or not it's immigration policies, whether or not it's COVID stuffs. And they'll use that to start a conversation and sort of get people interested, and then gradually pivot to Oh yeah, but also we got to have a talk about those people who aren't old stock Canadians. Is that a tactic that you've seen used?
I have seen it to a degree, certainly. I think the overriding theme is replacement. The belief that the powers that be, and we know what powers that they use the terms, they could use the term globalists or the far more anti-Semitic, phraseology. But ultimately, it's they want to replace you. And with M103, it was amazing to see the claims that Canada's bringing in 3 million Muslim refugees a year and to replace uh, real old stock Canadians, or during the Yellow Vest movement. They're trying to they are trying to replace old stock Canadians by destroying the economy, the resource extraction economy. With COVID, well, now those vaccines they're not really trying to save you, they're trying to kill you because they're trying to replace you with much more compliant third world immigrants. And again, old stock Canadians, they'll be eliminated so that the powers that be, the globalists, what have you, they'll be able to control these much more compliant people much more effectively, which I always find ironic because, again, if you look at COVID statistics, I think immigrants are again, at least some of the statistics I'm looking at are at least equal with Canadian born, if not surpassing Canadian born for getting them.
One of the things that always has struck me about those conspiracy theories is when you take a look at I'll use Alberta as an example because that's what this show is about and where I live. If you take a look at the COVID response that we've seen from the provincial government, the idea that they could manage a conspiracy, let alone their way out of a wet paper bag, is it's a stretch for me, I'll say.
But that's part of the conspiracy. So the ineptness of whatever government is in power, or at least perceived ineptness, or in some case real ineptness, um, that's part of the conspiracy as well, because it's self-fulfilling essentially. Whatever is being done, they can easily track into, well, this is part of their plot against us. And because, and I brought up social media a lot. I bring it up with the concern I have with my students, for example, even outside of what we're talking about now. Uh, the algorithms are created in such a way that it'll push the information you want to see right to you. And if it sees that you're only reading, these anti-vaccination conspiracy theories, those are the ones that are going to get sent to you. And as you fall further down that rabbit hole, and those people who might try to talk you out of it, try to talk you down from the ledge, well, they're part of the conspiracy, so you shut them out of your life. And sooner, eventually, you're surrounded only by people who agree with you. So you get in their mind that, well, I must be the real majority. The news that's telling me all this stuff online, that's going on in our society, that's fake news. The claim that, and I've seen this, for example, the claim that 85 at that time, I think 85% of Albertans had the vaccine. They genuinely believe, no, it's 1%. This is not true. Ridiculous conspiracy theories, and not just theories, but outright statements. One person saying that half of Israel has died as a result of the vaccine. Uh, Things that are provably false, but because they don't expose themselves to media outside their sphere, they only believe what they see.
It's always kind of struck me as like there's an improv exercise called Yes and the watching the conspiracy thing kind of unfold has always kind of struck me as the rules of the game are you have to say yes and then you have to add something else to it that somebody else can build off of. And it seems like that improv game has become the model for a lot of the way that these conspiracy conversations go because somebody will say something and somebody will go yeah and then they'll throw in the next level of crazy and then the next level and it just you can't stop the game. But I mean in an improv setting there's a terminus for it. But have you seen anything that seems to be able to break that yes and cycle?
Uh, among the true believers, not really. I mean, it's I it's frustrating because you look at what they're claiming, and again, verifiably false. It's easy to disprove, but the very act of disproving it in the minds of some of the individuals shows that it's true. Because if you were, well, it's I've heard it both ways, right? So there's one, if you try to disprove it, well, that must mean you're afraid of it. So you're trying to silence it. And if you ignore it, well, it must be true, because if it wasn't true, people would be arguing against it. So there's no real way to deal with that kind of mindset. I mean, they've created a box for themselves where any effort or no effort to dissuade from beliefs is confirmation of those beliefs.
It doesn't seem like, I mean, one of the in all of the things that you've listed off there, it seems like one of the big things that's missing is a desire or even a willingness to look at verifiable facts. I mean, there's arguments that people can use to say, well, no, you're part of the conspiracy, or this is yes and, but it doesn't seem like there's a much of a drive to go, well, is that true though? Is have you I mean, you have a lot of these interactions online. Have you seen any examples of somebody going, I don't know about that, or is that just not, is that a piece that's just missing?
No, I have, and the reaction is fascinating, actually. So one of the other movements kind of piggybacking on this is the QAnon, save the children, the belief that the child trafficking, and which is a thing. I mean, we know that human trafficking exists. We just had a very famous example of that not long ago, where a person was convicted. Um, but they go get some conspiracy theories when you believe that there are tunnels under New York and Washington D.C. and Toronto, where they're being bred for their undercurrent. I can't even pronounce the names of them, but basically, being bred for to create eternal life for the elite, essentially. It's laughable, except that people believe it, and can we see the dangers of that too? But in one forum, there was a group of individuals, some associated with Northern Guard, which is kind of an offshoot of the Soldiers of Odin. Some Soldiers of Odin, a few other people. They started another group basically on that kind of theme, save the children. Their big push was to have a list of pedophiles or people convicted of sex offenses published, and we could argue the utility of that, you know, perhaps. Uh, but I'm not sure I want a lot of very angry, hate groups wanting this information, because they're not going to use it for anything good. But just to get to the point, then was one conversation they were having, and there was a T-shirt. And again, there was a T-shirt with pizzas on it. It was in the children's section of like Walmart, and some of them were, saying, "Well, this is proof that the elite is, pizzas are a symbol for child molestations, pedophilia." And there were a few people who said, well, or it's just a T-shirt. Like, these are people who are true believers, except in this case, they question it. It was the only thing they questioned, and as a result of questioning it, some of whom these people claim they were themselves sexually molested as children. But as a result of questioning it, they started to be questioned. Well, why would you question this true thing? You must be a part of this, which got some of them back in line. Those that refused were kicked out and were kind of targeted, because they must be part of the pedophile movement as well. That were sent the deep state sent them in to try to disrupt their efforts, essentially. So those that question it, they either fell back in line, or they were targeted themselves eventually.
What you're describing there seems to almost be a, and I struggle to use this word, but it's the only one that's popping in my head, so I'm going to, with apologies. It seems like there's almost a sense of community and belonging that's driving some of this. Have you seen any evidence of that, or am I completely off base?
No, I think that's probably one of the most accurate ways to look at it. Now, prior to the internet, these individuals always existed. We knew they were around. They were the I'm not going to use the pejorative language that we use to describe these individuals, but they were the ones who we kind of, as a society, kind of looked at and said, "Oh, tinfoil hat people," right? Um, they were alone though. They weren't able to network because people they didn't know nobody else. As a result of social media, they're able to now network with others who have these beliefs. And again, it creates a sense I'm not alone. There are more people like me. And I find this not just in this kind of movement now, but also hate groups. I mean, a lot of young people who are disaffected. They might be in very difficult family situations. Again, not all. I don't want to paint with a broad brush. There are some that were, I know of some that were had parents who loved them, who cared for them, and gave them every opportunity they had to succeed, and they still fell into these groups. But I find a lot of them came from really dysfunctional backgrounds, and they were desperate for a family that wasn't neglectful or abusive. And much like cults, they kind of attracted these individuals and provided them that sense of family, that sense of community. So what you're suggesting, I think, is accurate, because these are people who are looking for others who will confirm what they believe, what they may have always believed, or what they've come to believe as a result of going down that rabbit hole. And it provides them some comfort.
You're teeing me up there in a big way, so I'm gonna take the opportunity. Um, do you think that there are individuals who exploit that need for community to their own gain?
Oh, certainly. You look at some of the individuals who've become kind of key figures in this movement. I think of the Plowski brothers, Arthur and David. I think of Pat King in Red Deer area. A number of other individuals too who are able to they got a charisma about them. You could comment on their knowledge base, but they certainly have charisma and are able to attract people to them. Um, and they certainly have a certain cleverness to be able to, in terms of manipulating people. Um, but it's the same rhetoric I see with people like, we were talking earlier about, the hate group in Calgary that emerged in 2006, Aryan Guard, which eventually became Blood and Honor. The leader of that was a very charismatic individual. And to look at him, you think, well, how has he got any pull? But he really did. So we're seeing these kind of groups. We're seeing uh, other groups, excuse me, we're seeing other groups that are emerging that are trying to use this kind of as a wedge issue to kind of pick out people. Well, if you're concerned about this and government interference in your life, well, here's how they're doing it. And they're trying to get younger people, for example. Like I think of Canada First, which is a group started by a guy named Tyler Russell out of Ontario, who uses the anti-vax, anti-COVID rhetoric as a means of, and of course, meme culture to try to attract members to his group, with varying degrees of success. Other groups like the Plaid Army, or Diagolon is what they refer to themselves as well. Using this kind of rhetoric that, and of course the toxic masculinity that's associated with too. I mean, what are you going to be afraid of a virus? Like, be a man. Don't wear a diaper on your face. Uh, which you know, taking precautions isn't unmanly, but what do I know?
You brought up a couple of names there that I want to go into because they are particularly relevant, and the overlap to me is where things get really fascinating. Archer and David. So, can you, for our listeners, can you give a bit of some history and some context for who are Archer and David, and what do you see going on there?
Well, Arthur and David are Polish immigrants, been in Canada for probably 20 plus years. They've been here for a long time. They're street preachers in Calgary, and they've been around and they've been in the news for one thing or another for years. I mean, I first became aware of them as a result of their claims that they were going to sue a medieval festival in Brooks, Alberta, because they weren't allowed to come back with their religious paraphernalia. That the organization said, well, we're kind of secular. We want to make sure everybody is welcome. And they, of course, claimed, anti-Christian persecution. Um, there was a time too when they wanted to march in the Calgary Stampede, where it said no, and instead kind of just jumped to the front and marched anyways. constantly being, being fined for a variety of reasons. But I really started to pay attention to them in 2017 when they became involved in, as I was discussing, the anti-immigrant kind of movement, which, there's some irony in that, of course. But the immigrants that they were opposed weren't the immigrants that they were. They were opposing Syrians, they were opposing refugees, people of color. So they began in I first really began paying attention to them when they started, when Arter was a keynote speaker for Western Canada, or sorry, getting my groups mixed up, Worldwide Coalition Against Islam, started by overt racists, Joey DeLuca, Jesse Walinga, and other individuals. But he was a speaker there, and they were railing against refugees, M103. There were posters, keep the sewage out of Canada. It was being guarded by members of 3% militia that were, carrying stun canes with them. Soldiers of Odin, I think maybe I don't know, maybe Northern Guard members were involved in this as well. Other hate groups were in the mix. And, I've got video of Arthur speaking to this group. Also, ironically, complaining to I think either a police officer or a bylaw officer, that the counter protesters were violating city bylaws and they needed to be enforced, which, again, given what they're into now, is profoundly ironic. But they've kind of gotten ties with a number of other groups in Canada. Kevin J. Johnson, of course, who moved from Mississauga, is a major supporter, and they're a major supporter of him. They've been involved with Pat King out of Red Deer. But again, they're very much pushing the anti-vaccination, anti-mask. They're claiming this is communism and Nazism at the same time. Again, ironic considering some of the people they associate with in terms of the right. But they've made Arter in particular has made has been very I guess he's been very successful in making this a means of elevating himself. Your listeners might be aware that he was the person who shouted "Get out" of his church to an AHS employee in Easter last year. That went viral. It was platformed by Breitbart, for example, and Steve Bannon. So he was pushing this information. When he was arrested, when David and Arter were arrested, and very dramatic. I mean, they dropped to their knees. I mean, they didn't have to. They did that on purpose because they wanted to get the visuals, and those visuals have been very effective. It's been particularly in the United States. As a result of that, Arter did a 3-month tour of the United States, where he was in the midst of the evangelical Trump supporters who have believed that the election was stolen from Trump, that COVID is a conspiracy against white Christians, essentially. And I would imagine that it was a very lucrative trip for him as well. But the people who organized it was a group that was very much involved in organizing the January 6th rallies that turned into an insurrection in Washington, D.C.
The fascinating thing about the platforming of some of Arter's videos to me has always been it's incredibly selective, because he has these moments where he will, appears to be standing up for the church and all of that kind of stuff. But there was another video that made the rounds where, when he was served with some tickets for violating a bunch of laws, and he went on what was probably one of the most, I'm going to use the word impressive, misogynistic rants towards a group of female police officers, where he openly was like, "You send a woman like I am a dog," and it was fascinating to see how his audience and the people who were supporting him completely overlooked that part and focused on the things that they wanted to focus on. And it seems to be a recurring theme. I mean, throughout this whole conversation, one of the recurring themes seems to be that people are being incredibly selective over what information they're choosing to acknowledge as information that they want to internalize. I can't even call it fact because it's not. And they're equally as selective about what they choose to dismiss. How do how do you deal with that?
Well, again, a really good example of that too is again another Ontario-based, although apparently he might have a residence in Alberta now. Chris Sakosia, also known as Chris Sky. Yeah, fantastic. That's what we need. Um, but this is a person who any pretense to being a devout Christian um, is I really can't say anything about that, but I certainly think a lot about that. Um,
There's questions.
yes, I have questions certainly, but this is a person who we know he was involved. He prior to getting involved in this movement was virulently anti-Semitic, anti-black, anti-immigrant. We've got the receipts, right? We've posted all this stuff, and Arthur considers him an ally, right? They support each other. Um, and not long ago, somebody who used to be in Chris's uh, orbit, who's working with them, was video recorded an incident where he was berating members of his own kind of group, essentially the three people who were working with them, violently screaming at them, swearing at them, threatening them. Uh, he flying off the handle in such a way I've rarely seen from an adult. And that was posted in various places. And that alone, we would think the way he was treating his own supporters, people who volunteered to help him, would be enough to get some people to reject him. But they justified it. People justified saying, "Well, he's under a lot of stress. I mean, he's fighting for Canada, so we have to cut him some slack." This desire to have heroes essentially, and not want to see your heroes fall. Donald Trump. I mean, a lot of these people are huge Donald Trump fans. Um, this is their savior, a man who has cheated every single person throughout his entire life. He's the great savior, and they don't believe it. I always find it funny that now that some of the January 6th insurrectionists are being convicted and sentenced to real prison sentences, they're beginning to question, well, why didn't Trump say anything in support of us? Why didn't he try to help us? And now they're getting, well, he's throwing us under the bus. Like, well, it's too late now, but too many other people don't believe that. And again, we see it here too. People who willingly use their supporters, it doesn't matter because there's still supporters that will forgive it. Will say, well, there's justification for that. Um, Again, use David and Arthur as examples. I mean, interestingly enough, I saw not too today, in fact, an argument on an individual's Facebook profile where somebody confronted him about his religious take on something. And he was sort of, how dare you, woman, respond to me, using that term woman as if
He
it's a
likes that
pejorative.
term.
He does. And that goes back to some evangelical sects that don't truly genuinely don't believe that women have any place teaching men. You need to know your place.
That's appalling.
It is.
Is really I don't. I mean, I don't even. I don't even know what to say to that. Would it be safe to say, like, one of the dynamics that I'm interested in is it seems to be to some degree that there are people who, by any number of circumstances, are I'm going to use the word vulnerable to misinformation and disinformation, whether or not it's personal hardship, whether or not it's trauma, whether or not it's knowing how to navigate social media and the internet critically. There seems to be a big chunk of people that I would just characterize as being vulnerable. But then there also seems to be this other group, like the Davids and the Arthurs, who recognize that and are, I'm going to use the word predatory. Am I wrong?
No, they would say you're wrong, but I wouldn't. I certainly see that. I mean, they look at this as an opportunity to expand their base. Uh, Arter is reveling in this. I mean, I've seen him post. They created T-shirts and hats saying "Get Out." They I think somebody created a great poster of him. Not a great poster. They created a great big poster of him that he was proudly standing beside. I mean, he's a celebrity. He was being treated like a celebrity in the States. He was, taking, limos everywhere. Comes back to Canada, he's still kind of looking at that and kind of, looking for that. Um, so yeah, and just with the idea of people are vulnerable, we've always seen this, right? I remember, a student of mine years ago, uh, you know, coming in, Mr. Phillips, there's evidence that humans didn't land on the moon. Now, really? Where'd you get that from? And they showed me a website. I go, well, yeah, it says on a website, but did you question where it comes from? It's basically a blog. It's a as somebody who wrote a blog, you should question the information where it's coming from, whether it's accurate or not, whether you could source it or not. Uh, but again, I think now we've seen that credulousness, willingness to believe, because you're always going to have some segment in that population. You're always going to have that. I think you're seeing a willingness to now weaponize that for people's own political or economic agenda.
I have to, one of the other things that struck me during this conversation is it seems like a lot of this fits into the broad themes, ironically enough, of radicalization, and in particular when we're talking about radicalization of other groups. I mean, you could swap out some of the names that we've used here today to talk about people who have been associated with ISIS or ISIL or Daesh or all of those things, and it seems like the same patterns at play, where you have people who want prestige, they want money, they want power, whatever the case may be, and they're very, very good at identifying people who will buy what they're selling. Um, and it seems like the same patterns are largely at work. Have you seen any sort of information that talks about radicalization or how to de-radicalize this, because it seems like it's the same mindset over and over again?
Right. Well, in my circle, of course, we talk about radicalization. This is radicalization. It's no different than, if we were going to use the idea of ISIS radicalizing people online. So, during that, time period, there were certainly people from Canada, Britain, France, United States, all around the world who were radicalized by what they were exposed to online. You always hear people like genuinely shocked that their friend or their cousin or their brother or their what have you, um, ended up in Syria fighting for ISIS. Well, you say the same thing now. I mean, I've seen people who are genuinely shocked that they're, a person they thought was a level-headed individual is now, marching in anti-vaccination campaign protests, or are now, involved in QAnon and believing that that's a real thing. They can't get their head around it. But again, the same things that radicalized individuals who joined ISIS are essentially the same things that are radicalizing others that are getting into these movements. As for de-radicalization, there are a number of organizations that claim to be de-radicalize. Some may be more successful than others, but it's tricky. I mean, there's no formula, there's no plan, like set plan how to de-radicalize a person and get them out of a group like this, be it QAnon, a hate group, uh, what have you. And that's part of the struggle too, because I know that I've had people even prior to becoming being identified as the writer for ARC, ask me, well, my friend is getting in this, my cousin, my brother, my sister, my parents. How do I get them out? How do I prove to them that what they're consuming isn't true? But again, it's hard because once they go down the rabbit hole, I don't want to seem hopeless. It's certainly not hopeless. I don't believe it is. I never give up on. I very rarely give up on people, but it's going to be hard. And I think we need, as a society, to really determine what we as a society need to do to help people get out of this. People who might not normally have gone down that road, but because of you know bad actors, or as we're undergoing our entering into our second full year of COVID, COVID experience, people who are sitting at home and doing nothing but consuming media, and falling further and further down that rabbit hole. How do we help those people? And I don't have I personally don't have a satisfactory answer to that. But I think we need to do, and we need to work on something so that, because if we don't, it's just going to get far worse.
I, I, I wish I could disagree with you, but I can't. Um, if people want to know more about the work that you're doing, the work that the Anti-Racist Collective's doing, the work that the Canadian Anti-Hate Network is doing, how do they follow, find all of that kind of stuff?
Well, we're all on Twitter, so if you want to follow the Canadian Hate Network, you can find their Twitter account. And I'm now a middle-aged man, and I can never remember what our Twitter accounts are. But I think it's at Anti Hate Canada. Mine is at Arc Collective. I think that's what mine is still.
Yep.
You'll see a bald man there instead of the symbol we used to have. The anti or Canadian Hate Network is found online. If you're willing to help, if you like to help, they certainly accept financial donations. Our researchers have done incredible work exposing some of these groups, and for example, the hate groups in the military, or individuals hate groups in the military. They've done a very good job of exposing that, and getting action from the government, for example. So, and there are a number of other really fantastic individuals out there that are doing great work in this. I can't list them all, but they're easy to find. Thankfully, if you find mine, I've always said that I'm kind of glad that I was doxxed at the time I was, because there are a lot of young people who are doing much better work than I'm doing, who they don't talk like a Gen Xer. They could actually get into these groups and not get exposed as like this Steve Buscemi, hello fellow kids, that I am now. So
I'm in the same boat.
yeah, it sucks. I don't like it at all.
No, I don't like the fact my left knee has been bothering me over the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's not fun either. Yeah, I used to be hip. I told my students I used to be hip, and they said, well, the very fact they're using the term hip makes you not hip.
Yeah, yeah. No, I had somebody call one of my favorite bands, of whom I have several tattoos. Oh, that's classic rock, and I was like, oh, God, help me.
Okay, so fun story related to that. I did a hike along Hadrian's Wall 5 years ago, with a bunch of friends and colleagues from work. And I landed in Edinburgh, and I waited for my two of my friends to arrive. And my friend Shirley, who lived in Scotland for a time and taught there for a time, she was willing to drive, which is good because I would have killed us all. But I was fiddling through the radio stations, and all of a sudden, No Doubt comes up, and Shirley and I, who are the same age, were talking about, hey, this great song. And then the horror dawned on us that we were listening to an oldie station.
Was it No Doubt before or after Gwen Stefani sold out?
Oh, I love Gwen Stefani. I can't say anything bad about Gwen Stefani.
That's okay. I did.
Yeah,
Um,
fair enough.
Kurt, before we go, is there anything else that you want people to hear? Is there anything else that you want people to be more aware of? I just want to sort of give you the floor, if there's anything else that you want to say.
Sure. I think the biggest thing I want people to take away from this is that, this is a struggle that we're all going to have to face. We're all going to have to do something about it. In school, we talk about bullying. We talk about the bully, the bystander, and the victim, essentially. And we need to stop being bystanders. When you see something happening, rather than pull out your cell phone and video recording it, which may be important in some cases, but say something, do something. Just don't let it happen. Uh, we need more people actually taking action and taking making a conscious effort to make our world a better place to be, essentially. And I'm optimistic to believe that will occur. When I first started the blog, I remember talking to journalists, and they saying, well, we would be really interested in getting this information out there, but our editors were saying, well, Canada's not a racist society, so nobody's going to care about this. It's fringe. Um, I guess if you could say there's any benefit from what's going on right now is that even news editors aren't saying this is fringe anymore. But there's been some fantastic journalism kind of exposing this as well. So be aware, be aware. Do your job. Do what you can to try to make this world better by speaking out, by being active, and whether you're a middle-aged white guy like me who's never experienced racism and never will, or or anybody else, like stand up for your neighbors, stand up for your people in your community.
Awesome. Kurt, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. I really, really appreciate it. And I think that there's going to be a lot of people who find this conversation very informative. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we would love it if you swung by our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab and signed up for a small monthly sponsorship of the work that we're trying to do here. It is because of the support that we receive from our Patreon sponsors that we're able to continually up our game, and it is tremendously appreciated. So I want to throw a big thank you out to them, and you can go ahead and visit that website and join and support us as well, because we need all the help we can get. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for listening and being part of these important conversations. And we will see you next time on The Breakdown.